Hey guys, welcome back to the Digital Designer Show. I'm your host Soumya and I have my co-host Shivam. Our podcast is about stories and life lessons which we believe will uplift people and help them to grow, which is also our motto. And talking about our motto, we are in a mission to touch lives of a billion people and put impact in the lives. So with that said, let's get started.
Hey guys, welcome back to our show, The Digital Designer Show. As it is said by a great poet, Nikita Gill, that show me the most damaged part of your soul and I will show you how it still shine like a gold. And when it's about music, you don't need gold. You will shine automatically. So we have our next guest, a hot guest, which we are waiting for us, is that he is a Carnatic music freak with around 30 years of experience and exposure. Hailing from Trichy, completed his mechanical engineering from SRM Chennai, a very meticulous and well organized, and also a great lover of energy conservation. And takes every task as his responsibility and completes it fast and cleanly. Works in US for turbo machineries and spreading knowledge of Carnatic music. He's a great learner and a listener of Carnatic music. Let me introduce with pleasure Mr. Anand Srinivasan. How are you feeling, Anand?
Yeah, I'm doing wonderful, Shivam. Thank you for that introduction. That's way more than what I would have expected to hear. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this show. I'm looking forward to conversing with both of you and with my friend Pradeep here.
Yeah. So let's come to the part of the Carnatic music, a music which has been from the Karnataka or South India, which is evolving from South India along with Hindustani, and which is a very classical type of music. We want to learn and we want to understand. So what is Carnatic music, Anand, and how it is different from other styles of music? We want to understand that first of all thing.
So one thing that we have to keep in mind here is any classical form of music across the world tends to have a huge history associated with it. There is Western classical, there's classical that's prevalent in many different forms across the world. And within India, if you look at the classical forms, it so happens that we have it classified as Hindustani or Carnatic. And as you had mentioned, Hindustani generally goes with the North Indian type of music, and Carnatic generally goes with the South Indian type of music. So a little bit about myself. I cannot sing. I do not sing. I do not know how to perform an instrument. However, I do listen to a lot of Carnatic music. I do listen to a lot of music in general, but 90% of my listening is specific to Carnatic. And the remaining 10% includes Drupad and Khayal and Hindustani and a little bit of pop and jazz and whatnot. Yeah. But despite listening to all the other forms of music, and of course there is, if we are born in India, film music naturally comes into that mix. So that's kind of the overall divide that we have. At least within India, there is the classical form of music, which turns out to be between Hindustani and Carnatic. And then we have the so-called non-classical, which generally falls under the film music umbrella.
Okay. So is there any part in Carnatic music and how many different styles are there in even Carnatic music if we see?
So that's a very interesting question that you bring up, So this is very interesting because when I was growing up, I was obviously exposed to Carnatic music because of if you grow up in a particular region in India, you're exposed to that flavor of everything that happens around you. If you're from Mumbai, you get to learn the Mumbai flavor of things, and the same thing happens to all of us. So when I was growing up, I was exposed to a lot of Carnatic music, and I hardly knew anything about Hindustani music. And And it's only recently in the last 10 years or so that I've actually started listening to a little bit of Hindustani, and now I'm able to differentiate a little bit about classical forms like Drupad or Khayam. So in a similar vein, there's a lot of distinction and there's a lot of demarcation and there's a lot of classifications even within Carnatic music. Usually, very generally speaking, a lot of these classifications are region specific. And the interesting thing about Carnatic music is the traditional form, as what we recognize today, tends to have a heavy influence of the Andhra region. Andhra and now, of course, Telangana, but traditionally it was the Andhra region where a lot of Carnatic, the history of Carnatic traces back to. So there is one form of the Andhra Carnatic music. And since we are from Tamil Nadu, both Pradeep and I, the form of music that I'm more exposed to is the Carnatic music from Tamil Nadu. And the interesting thing with Carnatic music in Tamil Nadu is it actually predates the music that comes from Andhra. So the Andhra music is heavily credited to Saint Tyagaraja, who was a wonderful composer and a great poet from back in the 17th century, the 1700s. He has composed a lot of music in Carnatic, a lot of songs. Pretty much all of it has been in praise of Lord Rama.
Right.
And so around the 1700s was when Saint Tyagaraja came about, and then there were two other composers that went along with Saint Tyagaraja in that time frame, the 1700 to 1800 time frame. Tyagaraja, Muthuswami Dikshidhar, and Shyama Shastri, who are popularly referred to as the Trinity.
Yeah.
The reason I'm saying all of this is because, I think you can see where this is headed. Carnatic music did start off as religious music. It did start off as being something that's catered towards God-fearing and spiritual, and it has a certain spiritual connotation, But the point I'm trying to make here is, even though Carnatic music is generally recognized as something that goes back to the 1700s and something that's associated with the Trinity, and 1700s is still a long time. That's still about 300 years of evolution in a music form, However, it turns out that Carnatic music was actually prevalent even before the Trinity. And that's where the focus in Tamil Nadu comes up, because there is something called Pannisai in Tamil Nadu, which is a form of religious music in Carnatic. And that dates back to the 1200s and 1300s, which is now we're going back in time to about 600 or 700 years, if not even longer, So in a certain sense, Carnatic music prevalent even before the Trinity from the 1700s came about. And if you start going deeper and deeper into it, it turns out that back in the 1500s, there was actually a Tamil Trinity, which is now a new term that has come about because people start going back in time to look at the history, And obviously, I've missed two other states here. There's music from Kerala and there's music from Karnataka also. So that's kind of a quick flavor for the way I view classifications within Carnatic music.
Yes, that's a great part of cycle has gone, Anand, and it's really very nice to listen it. And so I really want to ask, how you got into Carnatic music and how that has given you the impact, or what we can say as what has the big impact on your life, the Carnatic music, whether it has brought focus and why people should listen to it. My point is why people should listen to Carnatic music, why they should not listen to blues, or they should not listen to rock, is because different people have different taste. And
absolutely.
So why should You can
So
go.
that's a wonderful question, so before we go to that question, I'd like to quickly point out something. So this thing about going back 600 years or 700 years, this is applicable to all classical forms of music. I'm just talking about Carnatic because that is the one that I'm most familiar with. I do want to make a point that the Drupad form of music in the Hindustani tradition also dates back to the 1200s and the 1300s. And in fact, the Drupad form of music there is a Dagarwani style of Drupad which goes in detail back to the 1200s. So there's a lot of similarities in the Hindustani front as well. I just wanted to mention that, So coming back to Carnatic music, there should be absolutely no reason why people should choose Carnatic over blues, or people should choose blues over Carnatic, or blues over film, or whatever it is, It is my strong opinion that if you like a certain form of music, listen to it. If you don't like a certain form of music, so be it. Music is highly subjective, number one, I completely agree with what Pradeep said. So, disclaimer here, guys. I'm going to agree with a lot of things that Pradeep and you have discussed in the previous two podcasts, because Pradeep and I have spoken about a lot of these topics over multiple times in the last several years. I think Pradeep made a good point that if we are going to be starting about listening to music, then we should go out and start listening to all forms of music and choose the one that comes natural to us,
Yes, he was saying.
Perfect, Anand. And I think what Shivam is more coming to here is, say, if somebody should be enthused about, Carnatic music, what are the luring things in Carnatic music? That is what, if you're seeking what you go there, something like that is asking, what are the nice things that, you get attracted? Yeah. So can you shed some light there? Yeah.
So the interesting thing for me is, personally, I was obviously exposed to Carnatic music because of my background and my family, and everyone in my family listens to Carnatic music. So at a very young age, you start, you hear music that's played at home. You hear music that's coming to you in the background. And to be really honest with you, when I was extremely young, it used to bug me a lot because that's what they played at 6 a.m. And I found that jarring music to wake me up at 6 a.m. to go to school,
I can understand.
And then that's, I'm sure we all go through this,
Absolutely.
So the funny thing, and I still pull my dad and mom's legs about this. So the funny thing was, my dad used to play, Vedas and Rudram and all of the purely religious stuff. And then my mom used to play Carnatic music. And my problem was, why is it that I'm forced to listening to jarring music at 6 a.m. and it's waking me up? And this is the thought that you get when you're really young. And it turns out that, around the time when I was about 9 or 10 years old, so I've been, even though I grew up in Trichy, I've visited Chennai very regularly. Pretty much every year I used to come to Chennai. And I think I'm pretty sure Pradeep did talk about the December music season in Chennai. And I think he talked about a couple of venues where they do those holy concerts where they have only a lamp for the concert, So I used to come to Chennai, and my aunt got me hooked on to Carnatic music. I did not go there out of my own free will. She did force me to take me to those concerts. It turns out that when I went to the concert, it was more of a project for me because she had to keep me occupied, and she said, all right, fine. If you have to be occupied, why don't you try to recognize the name of the ragam in one of these songs, And I said, how the heck can I know the name of a raga if I don't know what a raga is? And she said, well, if you listen to this song, this sounds like another song that you heard. And the other song is something that I had heard several times at home. It was one of those quintessential M.S. Subbulakshmi songs, So that kind of perked an interest in me where I started thinking this was more like it's like solving a puzzle at that point of time. You're trying to hear a certain form of sounds, a certain set of musical notes, and then you're trying to link it and relate it to something else, and then try to identify what that other link is, and then come up with the name of the raga.
I can relate to that. I can relate to the curiosity in solving puzzles, Anand. I remember all the crosswords and everything that we used to do every day on the train during our long travel to.
And half the
and I can relate to where you're
puzzles, So let's finish the train of thought there. We would not actually solve the puzzle. It was just a matter of having that sheet of paper in our hand and trying to look at all the words and trying to rearrange anagrams and. The Hindu puzzles are one of the easiest puzzles if you think about it, because most of the time the answers are hidden as anagrams within the truth. So we would, if you remember what we used to do, we used to write down the entire word in a circle to see how many letters can be rearranged.
Yeah.
And if we can get maybe 20% of the puzzle done, or the 30% of the crossword done, that was a huge achievement,
Good. So your aunt had approached you in the right way to think of, identifying the ragas as a puzzle.
So that's so when you come and ask me today, how do you propagate Carnatic music to someone who hasn't heard this form of music, I'm really dumbfounded. This is how I got introduced to it. This is what piqued my interest, and even now, over time, initially it was the musical interest. Initially it was the, trying to identify something and relate to something part of it. And then over time it digressed into listening to film music and going into Ilayaraja's music, and then trying to dissect Ilayaraja's music to see what kind of ragas he has used. And my latest passion now is I've gotten away from identifying ragas and the music, and I've now gone into the percussion part of Carnatic music,
Talams. Rhythm.
Into talams, yes. Into rhythmic talam aspect, So how do you inculcate this interest in music, especially something like a classical form of music? Let's talk classical in general, The truth is, any classical form of music is not inviting. Any classical form of music is not peppy music. It's not something that you can listen once and then say, oh, wow, I like it.
Yes.
It's not something that you can listen to within 2 or 3 minutes. So I'm relating this to film numbers because I'm more familiar with film music. I know a little bit about jazz and blues, but I cannot speak to it because I'm not familiar with it as much. So if you think about film music, usually there's a song. The song is 3 minutes or 4 minutes long, maybe 5 minutes long. A lot of times the song will have a visual associated with it, a theme associated with it. So you'll know if it's a love song or a sad song or a happy song. So within 3 to 5 minutes, you get that emotion. You're done with the song. You get a certain set of lyrics. We all tend to understand the lyrics because it's in a language that we understand. The tune is peppy. The tune is quick. So everything is happening within 3 to 5 minutes, and we are done with it. And it's easier to relate to it in a certain sense. Classical music is not like that. Classical music is extremely difficult because number one, it is slow. It is not peppy. Mm-hmm. It takes a while for the groove of the piece to get started. And then once it gets started, it goes into the details, and then it goes into its highs and lows. And by the time it's complete, it's about 45 minutes, maybe sometimes even longer. And if you want to listen to an entire concert, that's going to be about 3 hours or so. So unless someone is truly personally motivated to go through that journey, I believe it's difficult to have someone get that interest into that form of music. Having said that, I'll give you one more disclaimer here. So the question that begs to be answered is, since we are a musical family, is it true that, so I don't have siblings, but all my cousins and I, we all grew up together, So the question is, if we are a musical family, or are all of us extremely interested in Carnatic music, And the answer is absolutely no. My own aunt, she could not get her own son to be as interested in Carnatic music as I am,
Yes.
And it turns out that as guys growing up in India, there's two things that really shape and mold us. One is the film industry and films in general. The other one is cricket, and I'm saying this very, very loosely. Don't rip me apart on this. So, cricket is something that we all grow up with. It turns out that in my case, cricket really did not fascinate me all that much. It's just Carnatic music that fascinated me all that much. And the point I'm trying to make is, within a same family, when you say that everyone is interested in music, do you think that the next generation will be completely into music? The answer is no. So that is where the personality and how the individual interest factor comes in,
Agreed. So you also mentioned about this interesting point, Anand, about the infusion of classical music into the Tamil light music or the film. Can you just talk a little bit more? A lot of people do like the classical influenced pieces which are coming in the movies. There are so many movies like Sindhu Bhairavi, Unnal Mudiyum Thambi. There are many, especially Ilayaraja compositions, and I don't know much, maybe even the modern composers are using inspiration from the Carnatic music. Can you just still talk something about it, about, how that influences and how it is helping, or I don't know whether it's good or bad, about that influence of classical music into the film industry?
Absolutely. So here is where Pradeep and I start disagreeing. Pradeep is a huge Ilayaraja fan. I like Ilayaraja. Unfortunately, I'm not a huge fan of Ilayaraja's music. I'm a huge fan of A.R. Rahman's music. And it turns out that we tend to associate, very generally speaking, we tend to associate Ilayaraja's music more with having a classical flavor to it, and we tend to associate Rahman's music to have more of a modern day synthesized peppy flavor to it. Mm-hmm. It is my opinion that Rahman actually borrows and uses a heavy Carnatic influence and a heavy classical influence, which sometimes tends to be missed when listening to his songs, The best example I can think of in Rahman's, there are multiple, we can talk for hours on Rahman's music alone, the one that personally touched me the most were his song Khwaja Mere Khwaja. I forget the name of the movie. Now that's
Jodha Akbar.
So that to me is a classic example of how Rahman tied together the pieces so beautifully well. That song has a religious aspect. He has a peppy number to it. He has a wonderful beat to it. The beat and the tune have not strayed away from the Qawwali form and the Qawwali theme to it. And it's a famous song, and it's a song that people have heard multiple times. And I think Rahman himself has acknowledged that he has learned the Qawwali music influence and the Qawwali form of music from Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan himself. So he has learned it in the most traditional and the most classical form ever possible. He has gone straight to the source, And this is just one example. This is not everything. This is just one example of how Rahman has brought in the classical influence into his songs, And the same is true of, this is everything that we are talking about here. This is true of most, if not all, music directors, most good music directors. Ilayaraja also did the same thing, and unfortunately, I'm going to be talking more about Ilayaraja and Rahman because those are the two that we are familiar with in the South, and that's the one that we've had the opportunity to analyze and listen to. Back in the day, Ilayaraja has done the same thing. He has also gone into the classical aspect, and there are anecdotes of how he has spoken extensively with Carnatic musicians like Balamurali Krishna and people of that generation. And prior to Ilayaraja, there were guys like M.S. Vishwanathan, who have also done the same thing. They have also looked into Carnatic music and classical music and bringing in the influence to a film type of music. There are ways in which let's try to tie it back to the original thought here. The original thought was, how do we inculcate a classical form of music, or how do we get people excited in a classical form of music? How do we get people excited to listen to classical forms of music? One approach is, like I said, classical form by itself is sometimes too difficult, and let's address it. Classical forms are usually a little too dry to listen to. So if you start introducing people through the film music route, there is also the chance that you can inculcate that interest and inculcate that. You kind of sugarcoat it and then help them understand it a little better, So there is that approach that could be followed. You follow a slightly tangential way and then bring the music in.
I completely agree with your point. Yeah.
No, I was going to say the key here is the listener has to be willing to assimilate classical form of music. If it still doesn't appease them and if it still doesn't please them, that's fine. It happens.
Agreed. Yeah.
It does happen.
Yeah.
It
But
will happen.
the question is, Anand, if you take any other, popular form of music, it doesn't matter whether you are able to appreciate the technical details of the music or not. For example, a movie music song is very accessible to everybody. And would you apply the same to Carnatic music? Do you really need to be, have an interest on the technicalities to start appreciating classical music? Or can you just, at a lower level, I should not say like lower level, at a very, more fundamental level, where you just respond emotionally to the music, right? Can classical forms of music be assimilated by the common man at that level, or some form of technical appreciation only puts you into that groove?
So So you're unfortunately asking this question to the wrong person, because I am someone that analyzes music to the core. And Pradeep, I think you can empathize with me on this. And this thing with Khwaja Mere Khwaja, obviously, as you can understand, I've listened to that song several times.
Yeah, that's a brilliant song. Yeah. I don't listen to Hindi songs, but I love that Khwaja Mere Khwaja, because it has a great soul to it. Yes.
Exactly. So
Shivam, I think wants to observe something here. Yes, Shivam.
Yeah, I want to ask you, Anand, there is one guy called as Krishna Das. When you said that when we actually inculcate the music from the Bollywood sense, or at a higher level, actually this Carnatiki or classical music evolves in a very wonderful way. It happened with me also when I listened to bhajanas and all that. For example, when we see the Krishna Das, if you know, he's an American vocalist, and he has sung like he was American guy, and he just started practicing Hinduism when he came to Karnataka. And his one of the album Ananda, it was selected for the Grammy Award for the best, nominated for the Grammy Award for the best new age album. See, best new age album, a Kirtan album, which was actually having the taste of Carnatic music and the Hindustani music. It's actually the Kirtans, bhajanas. So I definitely agree with one of the point that if we are going to inculcate this music, which Carnatic music has been grounding up and which not grown up so much high level, but if it goes through the path of what we call as higher platform, I really think people will appreciate it much further. Because see, when we listen to any music, at the end of the day, I felt, it's my opinion, that the peace comes from the classicals. Peace, the soothingness, the great soothingness comes from the old music. I don't know if you agree with me or not.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it gives a more restfulness, a calmness to a person who is doused in Carnatic music, unlike other forms of music which could be more aggressive. These are more meditative, no doubt about that.
Yeah. So I would like to ask you, like, there are different forms, like Alpana and Niraval, Pallavi, Ragam, and Tanam and Taniya Avataram. Now, which form you really love to learn on, and which is it by stage it will learn these improvisations, or it can be learned in a a parallel way? For example, if I'm having a boy who is around 5 years of boy, a girl 5 years of old, which age will be the right time to start working on learning Carnatic music? I wanted to ask you, because I feel Carnatic music or Hindustani music are quite difficult and need more practice and more time. So what age will be right, and what step by step stages a person should go to learn different improvisation and to learn the complete, indulge in that?
So, couple of things here. There is this. I think the quick answer to this is, the earlier you start, the better off it'll be, because of the obvious reason. When we are really young and when we get started on something really young, it gets into our muscle memory, and then retaining that knowledge is obviously much easier over time, and grasping that knowledge is also much easier over time. I'm kind of blanking out here right now. What was our previous, Shivam, what was your previous question? And please edit this one out.
Okay, so my question was, if someone wants to start learning music, so since there are a lot of improvisations are there, in Carnatic music, which one a student should start with, the first improvisation, and how he should proceed with different stage to stage?
So the answer is very clear there. In no form of music or in no form of art can we start with improvisations. We start with the basics, and then over time, the basics hopefully will lead to improvisations if there is the innate capability for that individual. And this takes a long time to achieve. A good example is, when we were going to school, we all were exposed to every form of art and sport and education. We had drawing classes, we had music classes, we had moral instruction, sport, of course, education. And within education, there was science, math, history, economics, every possible avenue. So we were all exposed to everything. And it turns out that, I hate to say we chose it, because, half the time we don't get the luxury of choosing things. But to a certain extent, at least with the art forms, we tend to gravitate more towards one form than the other. Some people choose painting, some people choose music, some people choose within music, some people may choose vocal, some people may choose instrumental, and so on and so forth. I'm still struggling to verbalize on the so-called right age to start learning music, because agreed that if you start early enough, it's good in terms of muscle memory. However, if you start too early, and if the individual is and if the individual gets an aversion against it, then
It
that's
stays.
not going to happen. Then it stays, and that's even more worse. And then on the other extreme, we all have heard of these cases where someone was an engineer until the age of 40, and then they decided to become a doctor, and then they went to medical school, and then by the age of 45 they became a doctor, and things of that nature. So that is also possible on the other side. What was that guy's name? Who? Hey, Pradeep, who's the guy? John McLaughlin. So John McLaughlin, he did not grow up in India. He is not Indian, but he has a huge Carnatic and Hindustani influence in his music, and Shakti, and remember Shakti series of albums shows that influence. So here is an example where John McLaughlin is a good example because he knows blues, he knows jazz, he knows the Western forms of music, and he has collaborated with enough Indian forms of music that he has developed that over the years.
Correct. Yeah.
So there is an example. You can argue that he did probably start his music early on, but he learned something as time went on. So there is that possibility also. So there is I don't think there's a clear-cut answer to say that you have to start by 3 or you have to start by 5. There are also geniuses within Carnatic music who were able to identify ragas when they were 3 years old. And this is all on YouTube. If you go look at child prodigies on YouTube, I can think of several examples. The best one that comes to my mind is the former mandolin player, U. Srinivas, who's unfortunately not with us today. He has single-handedly, I've been influenced by his music the most, and U. Srinivas was an example of a child prodigy where he started off really young and he conquered everything that I believe needed to be conquered in music. And for me, his music is one part. The biggest thing that I saw in him was his humility, It never got to him that he was a famous musician. He was always humble, always down to earth, always accessible. And that is something that, it's not just the musical aspect here. We're slowly digressing into a so-called...
and to add to that, he was part of Remember Shakti playing with John McLaughlin. Yeah. Did you have the chance to see him live anytime?
Who? John McLaughlin? Or
no.
You
Srinivas.
Oh, U. Srinivas, absolutely, yes. I mean, I've heard a lot of Carnatic music concerts of his, but not his Remember Shakti though.
Okay. I saw him in Remember Shakti when they performed at the Ohio State.
Right.
And at that time, U. Srinivas was there, and it was. To this date, I maintain that was the best concert sonically that I have listened to so far. Out of the many concerts that I have listened to.
So I do want to make a quick point here, the thing with, I know we're digressing quite a bit here. Sorry, Shivam, So the thing with U. Srinivas that I've always, the thing with U. Srinivas that has always fascinated me is, if you watch him on a concert stage, you have to always remember that U. Srinivas, by core, is a South Indian classical musician. And the South Indian classical, especially the Carnatic and even the Hindustani for that matter, the classical forms of music are not meant to be a bombastic form of music. They're meant to be calm and composed and slow, and you're not supposed to be exerting your body or making a so-called show on stage, gestures on stage. And when you start going into non-classical forms, or when you start migrating into the Western forms, when you start doing these fusions, there is a little bit of I use this phrase loosely here. There is a little bit of a showmanship when you come to something on stage, and Zakir Hussain is a great example for that.
Exactly.
Zakir Hussain, he is extremely classical. He has the gharana and the school of music, which is as classical as it can get, and he also knows how to portray himself on stage so that the audience gets excited. And I've heard several people say that if you compare someone like Zakir to someone like Yushinivas does a good job with music, but sometimes fails to get the audience excited, or alternatively, once his portion is done, he tends to sit back and not appreciate the other activity that's going on stage. And this is where the philosophical aspect comes in, because by training, the classical Carnatic form of music is meant to be that way, where you don't get bombastic on stage, where you're not supposed to get bombastic, and you're not supposed to. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm just saying that this is how the traditional aspect comes in. And in fact, if the guy is sitting in a Carnatic setting, he'll get praised for exactly that trait, that he is sitting back so quiet and relaxed, and he's not becoming bombastic about this,
Understood. Yeah.
So
it's a cultural difference.
It's a huge cultural difference. And speaking of culture and speaking of all of this, I'm trying to avoid bringing in the religious connotation here, because I have my own thoughts on this, and I'd prefer that we not go into the religious aspect.
Absolutely.
But the truth is, classical forms do have religion associated with it. So going back to your question of 5-year-old, So the other thing that can be used to introduce music to someone, to introduce Carnatic music, one approach is the film music that I said. The other approach is going through bhajans and going through religious approach. And to me, bhajans and Carnatic are not the same. This is my opinion. So there is the other approach where you try to bring in the religious aspect and the godly aspect, and then introduce Carnatic music or classical music, which again, if that's what pleases the individual and if that's what gets the individual excited, then so be it. I think Shivam, you mentioned kirtan and the kirtan form of music, which is perfect because the kirtan form of music started in I think northern Karnataka or Maharashtra, southern Maharashtra area. And the interesting thing is there was I think there was an individual by name, I've forgotten the person's name, I've forgotten the history now, but that form of music has actually come into Carnatic, and there is it's called Harikatha now. Harikatha and the Kirtan form of music, where they actually explain the music as they sing it. So they take certain phrases of Carnatic music songs, and then they say this is what the song is about, and this is how the song praises this god, and they actually go through that process of explaining the music and praising the god simultaneously,
Understood.
So there is that aspect also, and that goes into a more of a religious approach towards music, and that is not the approach that I personally have taken in listening to Carnatic music.
Yeah, go ahead.
So let me just finish my train of thought. Sorry guys, I tend to zone out quite a bit, which is why I'm trying to latch on to.
No, that's where the nice stories come from. So you're welcome to do that.
So, I was going to say that the non-classical forms are even more approachable because the language is usually one that we relate to. With Carnatic, it becomes even more difficult. At least with Hindustani, it's either Hindi or Urdu. With Carnatic, most of the songs are in Telugu, and unless you go really deep into the lyrics, you don't understand the lyrical meaning. Of course, if it's Tamil, you do understand the meaning because, I mean, personally, I know Tamil, I don't know Telugu, and I'm sure Pradeep will relate to that. And I tend to listen to more Tamil music in Carnatic than to Telugu. But having said that, my interest in Carnatic music is not the lyrical aspect. Lyrical aspect is only 5 or 10% of the music, in my opinion. There is much more to it, much more to the technicality of Carnatic music. That needs to be delved into and gone deeper.
I totally agree. Like even in the common form of music, I think almost everyone that people like a lot of songs without knowing an inch of what the lyrics is or what the meaning of the song is. And music is something just beyond the lyrics alone, right?
Right.
So Anand, one point I wanted to ask, when we speak about Hindustani, so in Hindustani there are different ragams. So rag Bhairavi, which is about morning ragam, and rag Yaman, if we speak, it's about evening, and for different emotions there are different ragam. So even the formation of Carnatic music is based on this, ragams are there, or it's different from Hindustani. My point was how it is different from Hindustani music, the Carnatic music.
So
please.
I guess the really quick answer is Carnatic and Hindustani are very different. At a really surface level, they both are classical. But the moment you start peeling away that layer, you start seeing differences really quick. So let's start with what you mentioned right now. You said in Hindustani there is Rag Bhairav. Perfect example, because Carnatic music also has Bhairavi, except that the Bhairavi in Carnatic music is a completely different scale compared to the Bhairav in Hindustani. The Bhairav in Hindustani corresponds to Sindhu Bhairavi in Carnatic. And Sindhu Bhairavi is an outstanding ragam. Okay, it's a Sindhu Bhairavi and the Bhairav of the Hindustani form of music. It's a really, really beautiful ragam. Why is that such a beautiful rag? Because Sindhu Bhairavi or Bhairav, whichever way you want to call it, it's one of those rare ragas that actually allows the use of all notes on that 7-note scale from Sa Re Ga Ma Pa Da Ni. So is Sindhu Bhairavi beautiful because you can use all 7 notes, or is it beautiful because it's beautiful by itself? I'm just asking the question. So let's go. I'm trying to tie it back to our discussion here, right? The discussion and the question is analyzing music. And the real question is, why even analyze music? Should we analyze music? And if we say something obscure that Sindhu Bhairavi has all 7 notes and all allows the use of all combinations of all 7 notes, so what? Is that what makes it beautiful?
Oh, it could be, but I don't know. I don't know that much to comment on this one.
So that's where I'm trying to lead up to, right? If we are to sit here and analyze any rag or any music and say that this is what makes it good, unfortunately, that's a very subjective decision there, right? Because what sounds really melodious to Shivam may not sound melodious to us, and that's perfectly fine.
Understood.
Now, the unfortunate part here is all of the classical forms, because of the fact that they've had the luxury of having existed for the last several centuries, all classical forms have a huge rigor associated with it. There is a huge amount of theory, there is a huge amount of technical expertise behind the scenes. There is a lot of theoretical framework that goes into all these classical forms of music.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that theoretical framework, it lends itself to being analyzed
Understood.
compared to the non-classical forms.
Understood. And
Just
this leads to
because
the. Yeah, go ahead, Anand.
No, I'm going to say just because it lends itself to being analyzed doesn't mean that analysis is the only way to assimilate that form of music. It's analyzable because of the fact that it has had this 600 years, 700 years, or how many ever centuries of gestation period that people have had, you know.
Understood.
There are several forms of music that don't fall under the classical umbrella, the so-called classical umbrella,
Mm-hmm.
which are equally beautiful, if not even more beautiful. The unfortunate thing there is it does not have a classical theoretical rigor associated with it, and therefore does not fall under this category of analysis. And that's unfortunate. And we do have to acknowledge that.
Yeah, you brought in a wonderful point, Anand. Thank you for this one, because I've always thought about it, but you have peeled one more layer and got into why certain things can be analyzed and why certain things are not analyzed. That is very, very nice. Thank you.
Absolutely. So yes, Anand. So as we know that there are like two, as of my knowledge, there are two forms of music. One is only instrumental music with only instrument, no vocals, nothing. And another is with vocal, you can say complete music, what we are listening nowadays. So I just want to ask you that what are the instruments that defines Carnatic music, that make Carnatic music what it is, what it was then and what it is now?
So the classical forms have been usually you have a main vocalist. The so-called accompanists have been a violin, a mridangam, and then the mridangam may or may not be accompanied by other accompanists. If there are other accompanists, it would be a ghatam or a kanjira or a morsing. And then there is a tanpura for shruti. So this is the usual, the so-called traditional setup.
Mm-hmm.
If the main artist is not a vocalist, the main artist can be a violinist. The best known example for a solo violinist has been Lalgudi Jayaraman, another person that I've been heavily influenced by when I was listening to music in my younger days. So there is violin, and then there is veena in Carnatic music. Veena is another very unique instrument. Veena has its roots to North India also. There is Rudra Veena, and within the Dagarwani school of Drupad music, the Rudra Veena is highly revered. In fact, there is some anecdotal evidence that if you learn Carnatic and Hindustani forms of, well, I cannot speak for Hindustani, I can only speak for Drupad because I know a little bit about it. Drupad and Carnatic, they go really in hand with the sounds on the veena, because the veena it's a stringed instrument. It's a fretted stringed instrument. So if anything is fretted, then you can create a distinct tonal sound in it, as opposed to something like a violin, which is stringed but not fretted. So there is a sliding scale there.
Mm-hmm.
So veena tends to be able to, at least traditionally speaking, a veena can recreate every tonal quality of tones and sounds that lends itself into Carnatic and Drupad form of music. And then I'm surely missing on a whole bunch of other instruments here. So I think I mentioned violin, veena, of course, mandolin, which was popularized by U. Srinivas.
Yeah. And these days we even have like Western instruments brought into Carnatic, right? Like saxophone
Guitar,
and other things.
absolutely.
Guitar,
Saxophone,
Prasanna
yes,
is
of
there,
course.
and yeah.
Yes.
So saxophone, there was another wonderful person, Kadri Gopalnath, who is synonymous with the saxophone name in South India. He's no longer with us, unfortunately. Um, so yeah, there is the Western influence. So interesting enough, speaking of Western influence, violin is a Western instrument. Violin came to Carnatic at some point of time. The history goes that sometime in the 1700s, late 1700s, it came to Carnatic music. So you remember I mentioned the Trinity, Tyagaraja, Muthuswami Dikshidhar and Shyam
Yeah.
Shastri.
Yes.
There's a tidbit of information that Muthuswami Dikshidhar's brother, one Mr. Balaswami Dikshidhar, is the one that introduced violin to Carnatic music.
Okay.
The reason I'm mentioning this is because, if I say something like this, and if I say, look how wonderful this is, and therefore Carnatic music is beautiful, I have heard people snicker at me. My own wife snickers at me, and she says, just because someone brought violin to Carnatic music, how does it make it beautiful? And this is why I keep saying that this is highly subjective, and
Yeah.
it's very possible that you try to introduce someone to a classical form of music and they just hate it, and that's fine. That's
Perfectly, yeah,
perfectly
agreed,
valid.
Yeah. Just to digress a little bit here, I want to just bring in one point that, we talked about the fusion band Shakti, which fuses like jazz and blues to Carnatic. Likewise, we have like L. Subramaniam here, who has written symphonies and so on, which has fused Carnatic music with the Western classical music. And, that is one interesting thing to see and to listen to. And also, we talked about the influence of, the Carnatic music on the light music and so on. What is the relationship between folk music and classical music on one another? Do you have anything to add on that one?
That's a very good question, actually, Pradeep.
So that's a very deep and detailed topic.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I am unable to talk much about it because I don't know much about the folk forms of music. And this is why I made that comment that we were talking a few minutes ago about the theoretical aspect and how some forms of music lend itself to being analyzed theoretically.
Yeah.
Folk has very generally speaking, folk music has had an influence in Carnatic. Carnatic has also had an influence in folk music. So both ways have worked out. I'm unable to give you specifics and examples right now because I'm not aware of it.
It's an ocean. Yeah, it's an ocean. And,
it's an ocean of its own.
And one more question I wanted to ask is on the evolution of Carnatic music. Do you see it evolving? How do you think the Carnatic music will be like 100 years from now or whatever? Because in my perspective, while many people maintain that it does not evolve, I do maintain that it slightly evolves because, from the classical acoustic instruments which they were using, now people have started using electronic instruments like Kunnakudi. There's this lady violinist, right? She uses an electric violin. Kanyakumari. She uses the electric violin, and there are people who use the electric veena and so on. That is form of an evolution with the modern world. And do you think Carnatic music, it's going to adapt, and how is it evolving right now, or is it going to mostly stick to the traditional ones?
So you raise a really good discussion point here. The bit that you sang between Bhairav and Yaman, there's multiple ways in which you can analyze this small piece. You can analyze it just for the beauty of the rag itself. You can just differentiate a so-called morning rag and evening rag, however way you want to define it. That's one layer. The second layer is you start looking at the lyrical beauty of it. the lyrical beauty is, it's something that we can all easily relate to. We don't have to be religious. We don't have to be pious or whatever. The connotation is very simple. It's Krishna as a kid. Krishna is trying to argue with his mom that he hasn't stolen the butter, and he's just gone out and he's come back home in the evening. Am I correct with the lyrical interpretation there?
Exactly. He's saying that I didn't even get the time to eat up.
Exactly.
So why you are telling? Yeah.
So Krishna wasn't even there at home. Then how could have he stolen the butter there? So how do you represent this? You can either represent this as Krishna being rather offended and sad and saying, how can you accuse me of stealing the butter? And that will give you a sad, a so-called minor chord to it. And that's where Yaman comes in. Alternatively, if Krishna is being playful and Krishna realizes that his mother has caught him, Krishna is going to be all playful and he's going to be in a slightly spirited tone. And in a spirited tone, he's going to have a sarcastic intonation to it. And he's going to say, oh, how can you say I did this when I wasn't even at home? And that has to be a slightly peppier tune to it. And that's where the morning feel comes in, you know. So this is a beautiful way to drive home the message of someone trying to get interested in a classical form of music, because I mean, let's take this for granted. If we are in India, this aspect of spirituality and religion is something that we have to cope up with. That happens on a daily basis for us. So, but we are all familiar with the concept of Krishna and the fact that Krishna had stolen butter and the fact that Krishna was a playful kid. So this is an easy way to drive home the message, you know. So that was, it's very beautiful the way you sang it and the way you and there is a third layer to this. Ignoring all of this, it traces you back to your childhood days because someone has mentioned the differences to you in a manner that you still relate to and you can still understand. And there is a third that is the third layer here, you know. So
exactly.
You really brought it home together. I mean, I think we've been talking about this for a long time, and you really drove home the message beautifully with that classic example.
Right. So it was really, you know, so much knowledge was there for the total Carnatic music, and we really understood so many things. But as we come to the last part, the part which is the most favorite part of this podcast, is that your message to young generation regarding the Carnatic music, or any message you want to give to the young generation. This is the most interesting part of the Digital Designer show. We love this part. Your message to the youth, the hustlers, and or all age of people, doesn't matter, but your message.
Absolutely. So before we get to that, couple of quick things. I think we were talking about folk versus Carnatic music. I'd like to quickly point out, I didn't know anything about it, but there's a lot of resources, and the best one is what T.M. Krishna has been doing recently, where he talks about the influence of other forms of music in Carnatic and how Carnatic has influenced other forms of music. So there's a wealth of resource available, obviously, on YouTube. And then the next one was evolution of Carnatic music. Carnatic music has evolved. All classical forms of music have evolved. Evolution within classical forms of music cannot be compared with evolution amongst non-classical forms of music, because in the non-classical form, the digitization is much more quicker. With classical forms, it doesn't happen as quick. But Carnatic has certainly evolved. It will continue to evolve for the better. I'm an optimist. This is where Pradeep and I start to disagree. I think Pradeep made a statement in your previous podcast that he tends to shy away from the digitized forms of music lately. Whereas I strongly believe that Carnatic music is headed in a wonderful direction. There's a lot of scope for growth. There's a lot of scope for the future, for a good future in Carnatic music. There are many people who believe that the yesteryear musicians performed better and that the so-called younger generation of musicians today are not as good as what used to be back in the 50s and 60s. I disagree with that. I think today's so-called younger generation of musicians are on par, if not even. I would even go astray to say that they are even sometimes better. This is debatable, obviously. And as for a message for anyone, doesn't have to be young or old. The message is very, very simple. Let's all do what we like to do. Let's all do what we want to pursue as a passion. If classical and Carnatic is what we see as a passion, very good. If listening to all forms of music is what we see as a passion, that's very good. If music is not at all a passion and if we want to pursue something else, that is also equally good. The point is we've got to do what we like doing, One of the things that I've recently, over the last 10 years or so, I've started doing long distance running, like half marathons. I started doing this just as a form of exercise, and then I slowly started stepping it up, and then I started doing longer and longer distances. The key here is when you're doing something like a 3-mile run or a 5-mile run, every time we do that run, it will be painful. So we have to sit back and question ourselves, why exactly are we doing this? Are we doing this just for a workout, or are we doing it for bragging rights, or are we doing it for a bigger reason here? And if we figure out that bigger motivation or a bigger reasoning within ourselves, that'll help us, that'll help point us in a certain direction. And this is true of everything that we do. As long as we can justify within ourselves that this is where we want to be headed towards, that'll help us. That'll help us achieve our goals much easier.
That's great, Anand. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And I also wanted to add one thing, in the YouTube, there is this Darbar music channel, which is a great place. I think it's a festival which happens in the UK, and there's a separate channel for Darbar, which concentrates on classical music, mostly Hindustani and a little bit of Carnatic. It is just amazing. Everybody should check the channel also. And I leave it to you, Shivam and Soumya. Thank you again, Anand.
Yeah, thank you, Anand, and thank you, Pradeep, as well. So it was a great session.
Yeah, thank you, Anand. And we had really understood a lot of deep in sense of the Carnatic music. Earlier, we had understood the deep evolution of the Western music from Pradeep, and now listening about the Carnatic music was really, very nice. So guys, hope you love this show. Next time we'll again meet with a new hot guest with new experiences and new stories. We always love your support that inspire us to come up with new stories every time. We also believe that everyone have a story in their life worth learning from them, life worth emotional to weep on them, life worth growing with them, and life with knowledge sharing from them. If you have a similar story, please reach out us in our Instagram page and become a part of our family, because